So, tanks are back at the lowest pick rate of any role by far. And I guess, this is a thing? Who would have known that removing all stability from your game might destabilize the game to the point where we run back into instant tank queues and DPS and support hell? Let's back up a moment. Tanks feel awful to play in Season 9, and whilst complaining ad infinitum and screaming about bringing back 6v6 sure is fun, yelling into an echo chamber is only really a hobby and not something I have the followers to make a vocation. Just yet. After Blizzard's most recent table flip of the entire game with the Season 9 patch, the player base had just about finished their game of 52 card pickup, and we found ourselves once again in the weird position where what is good in high ranks has completely diverged from what is good in low ranks. We've seen the game in places like this before. It isn't completely unusual or even unprecedented, but the current meta isn't simply a result of misbalancing individual characters like normal. It's a result of a fundamental breakdown of their systems. Most people already obviously guess and know that bigger health pools plus less healing equals Discord bad, tank sad. But the reality is that two very simple changes have resulted in something I don't think Blizzard predicted. And the recent dev notes have revealed that Blizzard either don't really have any idea how to fix this, or even worse, don't even know that this is a problem, because all they're doing is reverting the DPS passive to 15%. And to be clear, we're in crisis mode right now. The current state of ranked is really bad for the game. It also seems that Blizzard outright admitted at the Creators Summit, something we have already pretty much known, but never had outright confirmed. The decision to go to 5v5 was made, by and large, just to balance queue times because nobody wanted to play tank. Now, if the peasants start revolting because their working conditions are terrible and they don't want to make food for you anymore, you can solve the problem temporarily by Thanos snapping half of them and creating an excess of food. Hey, it's a hell of a lot cheaper than actually improving working conditions. But if you keep treating the survivors in the same way, eventually they're going to stop working altogether. The general consensus of Season 9 has mostly settled down after a couple of weeks, and one consistent theme is naturally DPS are happy, supports are a mixed bag, and tanks hate their lives more than Bobby Kotick at a charity event. This is pretty obvious to parse. The DPS passive means that tanks are getting less healing, and tanks getting less healing means that tanks necessarily need to be more careful about expenditure of resources. Because if you drop 300 HP, your time to restore it has been increased by like 25%. Advice on the internet when tanks come and question how to tackle this has been pretty much universal. Just play the video game better, dumbass. Which somehow hasn't been much help to low rank players, because if they were capable of playing the video game better, they probably wouldn't be in silver. If you're rightfully frustrated as tank and confused about this patch, you may have reason to be, because we didn't get here directly. We got here through the nightmare balancing monster, causing a lot of changes through cause and effect. The aim of the patch was primarily to address the skill flaw of aiming by giving larger hitboxes, and smooth out damage spikes caused by irregularity in aiming, again through these larger hitboxes. The logic goes like this. Because of the movement acceleration in Overwatch, we need larger hitboxes in order to bring down the skill flaw and barrier to entry for the game. See this video for more on this. Because of those larger hitboxes, we have higher damage numbers around so people can hit things more consistently. Because of the higher damage numbers, health pools need to be increased to keep time to kill the same as the 1v1. With increased health pools, people have the option of stacking high health per second supports to prevent deaths, so we need a global healing nerf to stop fights dragging on in stalemate forever. Supports would absolutely despise being nerfed directly, and let's be honest, supports buy the most amount of skins, so let's go with the cauterize effect from paladins so that the healing nerf isn't as directly feelable. With the DPS passive reducing healing, tanks then need some sort of compensation buff so that they won't feel terrible, and with the higher health pools on the rest of the cast, tanks need some sort of compensation damage buffs so that the pressure they can put out on squishies remains the same. This is the basic logic we're following here, and it's even better for Blizzard because we can hit 3 birds with 1 stone. As well as tackling the issues caused by acceleration in the hitboxes, we can handle 2 other issues. Secondly, tanks being able to survive forever has been complained about in the past. Orisa, for instance, has been generally hated to play with and against because most of her strength comes from the fact that she is literally impossible to kill. And thirdly, the strength of supports have been widely regarded as a problem before Season 9, with most of the discussion centering around the high dueling potential, raw healing numbers, the strength of pocketing DPS, and abilities like Suzu, Life Grip, and Lamp stopping kills and slowing down the game. So yeah, we can hit everything at once with no negative effects. Wait, don't stop playing. No, tank players, come back now. You aren't allowed to leave. Hey guys, no, of course we haven't tried anything. Yeah, I can up the battle pass experience by 100. What if we go to 1 tank, 3 DPS, and 3 supports? Why does it have to be a couple of years between sequels? I don't know what you're talking about. This patch addresses everything. Maybe? The first major problem with this passive is that unilateral uniform changes affect characters non-uniformly. That's a lot of words to say that the previous DPS passive increased reload speed on getting a kill, which does literally nothing on Hanzo and Eterna on Ashe, and the previous DPS passive before that increased movement speed on getting a kill, which does almost nothing for Ashe and Widow, and a ton for Genji and Tracer. This has obviously never been unbalanceable, but especially in the short term these changes have always caused issues, not because the ideas of themselves or sweeping changes in general are bad for the game, but because Blizzard has never been fast enough at balancing individual heroes to make up for the destabilization caused by these changes. This could obviously change right now or any time in the future. At the end of the day, this has never really been a problem with development time, because accurately calibrating numbers isn't a time-intensive task, it's a task that demands vision and foresight. In reality, flipping the table is flipping the table, and accurately predicting what the community is going to make next after you sweep all their Lego onto the floor might not be practically doable. In even more reality, the strategy of decreasing healing by 20% and then increasing health pools to account for this is a change that betrays either ignorance of their systems or no foresight at all from the developers. To get there, and to get here, we got a little bit of work to do. Tanks use resources to protect damage and therefore pressure over areas of the map which are good, so that the enemy team can't exist there and so that your team can exist there without having enough damage pressure put on themselves in order to move them from that area. Tanks do this differently, and there really is only a couple of factors which decide how this happens. Firstly, range. Melee tanks project damage around corners and use their cooldowns to do large cycles of pressure around the corners to force space away from them. Ranged tanks pressure good positions from their corner without relying as much on these big cooldown cycles in order to force space. Secondly is mobility. Since mobility allows them to effectively apply that pressure where they want it when they want it, without necessarily having their resources burned down when getting to the place they want to apply that pressure. Characters with high mobility necessarily have to put out less pressure and therefore damage. We have 3 simple archetypes that fit the 3 roles: low mobility, low range, high mobility, low range, and high range, low mobility, also called brawl, dive, and poke. Importantly, especially for this patch, moving from one piece of cover to another costs resources. You're going to take some level of damage along the way. In addition, being fatter and being closer to the enemy costs more resources because it makes you easier to hit. The real rub comes here. Characters with low range are incentivized by their cooldown structure to purposely use their resources in a burst to cleave into the enemy team for periods of time where they put out higher pressure. These pressure cycles are made better the more stuff they're given, because they can go deeper and further into the enemy team. This is kind of the premier thing that Overwatch does, which sets it apart from other games. The game is, at its core, a positioning-based shooter about space control based on resource expenditure. So naturally, the unilateral minus 20% throughput from healers means that tanks who want to use resources to do stuff will obviously be impacted more. Sorry for stating the obvious. The logic is that by just adding a proportionate amount of health and armor, we can make the pressure cycles from the tanks most affected essentially the same as before. That's fine, we flip the table. It's going to be unbalanced for a while until Blizzard reacts and patches the individual characters. It's not broken as a concept, right? It's just badly balanced at the moment. Yeah. So the first problem is the actual skill required to play around cover properly and not be burned is difficult. Regardless of what you do to the health pools, it's still objectively bad to let yourself get burned down while the replenishing resources are lower. This has resulted in a classic Reddit response: just get better at playing tank and you won't have this problem anymore. Play in cover, don't stand in the open, be more decisive. This is of course always completely correct. The objectively right way to play tank has simply just gotten better with this change. Spending resources by being loose with positioning and in general being, well, kind of dumb with where you stand has always been bad. But at a certain point, telling people to just take cover more and be smart with positioning isn't actually advice. It's just telling them to get better at the game. Who knows how many tanks just this response in itself has driven off the role or even off the game entirely. My bet on scouring the internet is, yeah, it's going to be a lot. Okay, so let's assume that we sorted this and learned to be smarter, play faster, and let's completely ignore the fact that as we raise the rank, the enemy team are also going to get smarter at burning you down. The second problem is, I mean, you know what I said about resources? Closer range tanks or tanks with a cleaving pressure cycle get a disproportionate amount of extra pressure out of more stuff. Theoretically, let's say Reinhardt is able to not take any spam when getting into melee range, increasing the health pool and therefore maximum resources he can have. The pressure he can put out when played at his best is even higher than before. And if this is true for Rein, it's also true for dive tanks. Winston and D.Va, when played properly, will always be diving with more health, and more health means more pressure. This is brought to a head with Bull, who can use the extra health given to him, combined with his shields, to be completely independent of healing. So if I'm trying to put out your house fire and I have a hole in my bucket, I've got to run as fast as possible from the sink to the fire. And you decide, because you're an asshole, to stab a hole in a larger bucket and give that to me instead. Sure, I might be better at putting out the fire for you, but you shouldn't be surprised when I start to wonder why I'm trying in the first place. Thirdly, since these natural peaks in pressure of the tanks when they aren't burned down have got higher, the player base are leaning even harder into counter meta. The devs have been quoted recently as saying that tank buster characters aren't really something they think is particularly problematic. Personally, I do actually for the most part agree with them. The efficacy of counter swapping is not as productive as people think, but that's the problem. People think that. So with the extra power shift into the tank category and the new focus the enemy team may have on burning you down because they know it actually matters now, if you play Bull, you're going to have a Sombra on the enemy team. If you play a Brawl character or Winston, you're going to have a Reaper or Bastion on the enemy team. And regardless of those two, due to the power of Dive and Tracer at the moment, you're always going to end up with someone in your backline which your team theoretically should be able to deal with and never do, whilst you're trying to make space on frontline with no resources because 4 people have turned to kill a Tracer. This sucks just so bad. I'm not done yet though, because we still got to get here. The Nightmare monster of cause and effect is still kind of hungry, and even when talking about individual characters, a unilateral change doesn't even slightly affect different players of the same hero in the same way. At bronze level or below the basic skill floor of the game, where babies are still basically learning to use the controls, both damage and healing is a lot lower. Healing is easier to apply than damage, so sometimes you will get some sustain, and cooldowns at this level are generally not used regularly at all. The effect here is pretty simple. The health increase outweighs the effect of the sustain decrease, because the damage coming in is generally slow. This works. I mean, this has been a net buff, especially to characters like Reinhardt, because tanks can feel a little unstoppable when they don't ever get burnt down. But it does work, I guess. At mid levels or even at the skill floor, we get massive issues start to arise though. Support players hit their generally optimal levels of healing without random downtime from people just forgetting to press their buttons. Contrary to most people in this rank's belief, this is where healing throughput onto tanks is at the highest of any skill bracket. But naturally, since fighting for angles and dueling between DPS requires, well, moderately skilled play, tanks tend to get burned down by the entire enemy team almost to a point. But it's not only damage, because players at this level can now press buttons, and though they won't use them properly, chucking them at the big guy on main is easy to do, and more importantly, feels a lot more impactful from a gameplay perspective. This goes for both your support and their support. You'll get the most nades, the most Suzus, the most discords, the most lamps, and become essentially the focus of the game. So when you're the focus and all other things being equal, you've got 20% less healing and you end up going to Reddit to complain. Their response is normal, like it's the only response you can give. Play better, don't stand in the open, conserve your resources, play more decisively. As I've already said, this is basically non-helpful advice, but it represents a real truth behind the scenes here. The skill floor to play these tanks, especially the ones who play at mid to close range or have any interest at all in using resources to do a pressure cycle, has raised massively. Here's the win rates for tanks in gold. The most picked tank is Zarya with 44% win rate. You'll find loads of tanks at this rank completely abandoning Ram, Reinhardt, Junker Queen Hog, Mauga, Orisa and Zarya in favour of dive tanks and Sigma, not because that list of characters can't be played at these ranks, they can, but because they feel terrible to play as the focus of every ability and require a disproportionate amount of skill to play around cover. Even worse than that, if somebody actually wants to play these characters in this environment and they're not good enough to play them while conserving resources, their supports have literally no choice but to swap to higher healing intensive characters or Lucio. This, to be clear, is the cause of the high percent win rate of Lucio. He's at about 53% at the moment. The speed pushes bad tanks towards the more optimal playstyle. Once people hit the high ranks though, they realize that burning the tank almost exclusively only makes sense occasionally. Not only does damage need to go more towards controlling angles against the enemy DPS, but support also needs to go towards whoever's fighting those angles, and definitely not exclusively to the tank. Because of this, the sustain goes down on tanks, the damage going into tanks starts to be a little bit more sensical, and cooldowns are more used to take duels and fight angles instead of being thrown directly at you. Instead of burning tanks because haha, big guy easy to hit, players actually start burning tanks if there's nothing more important to do. If we just ignore Mauga now because screw explaining a 57% win rate today, Jesus Christ, what the hell is Blizzard doing? The characters who I've seen play either interact less with the healing system or have a very strong pressure cycle which can take advantage of the extra health. Some teams have just decided that the healing system and the rewards for playing optimally around cover are just not worth the effort to interact with unless the map calls for it. So we have this completely degenerate comp popping up with Zen Lucio, whose only aim is to engage with maximum resources onto the Discord target. So where we ended up at, the throughput onto tanks and the total resource pools of tanks have always been balancing factors, but I don't think increasing the total health pools really was the one here, lads. You've not only misbalanced high ranks, but you've literally made your core tank player base from silver to platinum hate their lives for another 3-week period. And this is coming fresh out of the Mauga fun zone we just went through at Christmas, so their patience may be a little thin at the moment. And Blizzard, please tell me this is a joke. Please tell me it's a joke. So here, now that you've sat through all of this, I can finally reveal my hand because you're captive. Something 5v5. The simple fact is when you remove the off tank from 6v6, you don't only lose the feel of being with an off tank duo. In order for, let's say, a Winston, for instance, to be able to still output proportional pressure and force space during his pressure cycle, the extra resources from Bubble or DM has to be centralized into either the support or the Winston. Now we found that centralizing the resources into the support has created really degenerate effects, such as the general sustain being too high and the game feeling as if it revolves around the support players. So I guess instead of support being given the stuff, they decided that the main tank has to be given the stuff. The reason why 6v6 has so much depth is because we had 3 different people with resources who could give it to the main tank if they wanted to allow their pressure cycle to be as good as possible. The pressure of these initiating tanks therefore just increases as rank goes up and coordination gets better. Now instead we've got a situation where all the resources have been centralized into the initiator and the maximum pressure a tank can put out has been lowered to almost a skill floor. So all you really need anymore is to engage with full resources. In a way, the entire game has been completely refocused from coordination to just conservation of resources until you want to engage, which means that tanks are necessarily less active, less engaging, and more boring. So I really do have to ask, why are we making the role we literally switched the format for feel so bad to play that they are leaving again in droves? Who the hell cares if Reinhardt has 50% win rate when playing him is absolutely miserable? Yeah, I know, revert the health increase on the DPS passive for tanks, maybe give them a 30% reduction in negative status effects too, seems like a pretty good idea. If you got to this point, please like and subscribe. I'm an Overwatch coach that streams every single weekend 4 till 8 PM GMT. I do VOD reviews for free. If you want one, go to my Discord, put it in the format, and I'll do it for you. Also, if you want actual full-time coaching, I do that as well over here. I know what I'm talking about. My bona fides are out there somewhere. You'll just have to find them. I'm not saying them here. Anyway, thank you very much. Love you all. Have a great day.